Hey there folks, Andrew Swan here, and today I am going to show you AVSmeter. This is a fantastic program that's designed to do comprehensive benchmarking on AVISynth scripts, but also you can use it to check your AVISynth installation and or installations to make sure that they're set up properly. So it's kind of a must-have, in my opinion, if you're going to be working with AVISynth on an ongoing basis. I've used it to determine speed differences between different plugins, and it works really, really well for that. So, before I do that, I'll just remind you that I have a blog, macelatthefront.blogspot.com. There will be a text-based version of this tutorial up there, although AVSmeter is so simple to use that honestly the built-in documentation is really good if you want something text-based. For basic usage, it is really straightforward. I should also mention that I take no responsibility for anything that happens to your system as a result of using this tutorial. I make sure to virus scan all files and then run through a workflow myself before showing it to you on videos like this. But if a virus writer has managed to sneak in something into one of the binaries, or your system is set up in a different way than mine and it borks something, just know that there's always a risk of doing that, so behave accordingly. All right, that being said, let's get started. All right, first, in order to find AVSmeter, you could just type it into a Google search, but just to be kind of complete about this, I generally just go to the AVISynth wiki, go down to Utilities, and scroll on down to Debugging and Diagnostic Utilities, and you'll see a link to AVSmeter there. And you'll notice right away that this is a command line utility, as the screenshots demonstrate. Don't be scared. This is a much simpler command line utility than something like FFmpeg, although it does have a number of different switches, as you will see here. AVSmeter primarily has two functions. One is to benchmark, and the other is to check installations, which I'll show you what that looks like in a sec. So just go on down and go to the download link. And yes, this is from a Doom 9 forum post, but that's because it's done by Groucho2004, who frequents the forums. He does really good stuff, including the Universal AVISynth installer, which is how I install AVISynth on my system. You can just go ahead and go on over to AVSmeter, click on it, and when that's done, go ahead and virus scan it just to be on the safe side. Looks pretty good. All right. So when that's finished downloading, go ahead and go to your downloads folder. You'll notice it's a 7-zip archive. If you don't have 7-zip installed already, you can grab that from www.7-zip.org and install that first. Doesn't matter whether you get a 32 or 64-bit version, just, unless you're running on a 32-bit version of Windows, 64-bit version's fine. All right, anyway, when you have that set up, just double-click to open the archive, and you will see that there's this folder inside. And you literally can just take this folder and drag it over wherever you want on your computer, and that will complete the first part of the two-part installation. Technically, all you need to run AVSmeter is just one of the binaries, which you can see if you open up the folder here. So there's AVSmeter and AVSmeter 64. If you are running the 32-bit version of AVISynth, then you'd use AVSmeter. If you're running the 64-bit version, you'd run AVSmeter 64. And you can literally just drag this binary into whatever folder you have AVISynth scripts in, and then you can run a command line from that directory and run AVSmeter. But I like to set it up so that it can run from any directory on my system, so I don't have to keep copying over the binary over and over again. And I'll show you how to do that in a sec. What I'm going to do is open up a folder I have on my desktop that's just called miscellaneous AV tools. I mean, again, you could do this in your user directory or whatever and just copy over the AVSmeter folder. And yep, it's there. You'll notice that you'll have this AVSmeter 64. You'll also notice that there's this doc folder. And remember what I said about the documentation being really good? Well, if you double click on this avsmeter.html file, here you go. It's got literally everything you can do with AVSmeter right in there. Most of the time, I don't mess with too many of the additional features here, but I will kind of briefly go over them. All right, but first, we have to find a way to point the system path statement to AVSmeter in order to run it from any directory on your system. And this is pretty simple. Just go into your directory that contains the AVSmeter binaries, and then go up here to the address bar, click once on it to select the path address, then copy that. And what we're going to do is go to the start menu, type run, and type in control space sysdm dot cpl comma 3. It's a weird command, but basically what it's doing is it's bringing up the system control panel entry and gets you straight to the advanced tab. So it saves you a few mouse clicks. Click on environment variables, then go over under system variables, go down to path, select that, click edit, and just go ahead and click on new, then paste in the location of AVSmeter, hit enter, click OK, OK, OK. And there you go. AVSmeter is now set up. If you want to test this, you can open a Windows command line or PowerShell prompt. I generally use PowerShell, but functionality is the same between these. So, and just go ahead and type AVSmeter, and you should get something like that. Okay. So now that you've got AVSmeter installed, let's go ahead and go to a directory with some script files in them so we can play around with this a bit and show how it works. You will notice that in this case I've got 3 different AVISynth script files, and so we're going to pick one and benchmark it. Now, you could open up a command line and type in some commands to navigate to the directory where your video files are located. Or you could just hold down the Shift key, right-click, and click on Open PowerShell window here. And that'll take you right to the directory that you're in. Pretty handy little thing. All right, so let's move this over to the side for a sec so we can take a look at the names of the files here. But let's go ahead and benchmark YFRC. So we'll do AVSmeter YFRC.avs. Or just, to let you know, PowerShell, you can do a tab autocomplete. We'll add this little sort of dot and backslash in front of the file names, but it doesn't affect the running of the program. It's just a PowerShell quirk. All right, let's just go ahead and try running that. So what it'll do at first is it'll check AVISynth and make sure that everything is running properly. Then it'll go over and scan the script to make sure that there isn't any obvious formatting errors or weird stuff like that. And then it'll load the script and go through the process of doing kind of a test render, so to speak, where it's running the script, but it's not actually outputting anything other than sort of internally. You'll see that there's a number of different bits of information here. So obviously we get the total number of frames, the length, the frame width and height, the frame rate, the color space, as well as a bunch of stuff for the audio data. You'll get the current frame number in the rendering process, the total number, but more importantly, you get this FPS system here, where you have the current frames per second, the min and maximum. The max I've found in practice kind of just behaves wonky, so don't look at that too closely. But the average is pretty solid, and that's generally how you gauge how fast a script is going to be. Process memory usage, this can be useful. If you're running a 32-bit AVISynth script and this starts getting up around 2,900 megabytes, then you may start running into some speed loss because it's having to swap memory, or it's butting up against essentially the limitations of memory usage for 32-bit processes in Windows. Then there's the thread count, if you're wondering whether something is properly multi-threaded or not. And then CPU usage. And then, of course, the total time combined with a remaining time until it finishes, at which point you will get kind of this snapshot of how well the rendering did with a couple of averages and then an elapsed. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. Now, notice up here that it's also showing what version of AVISynth you have installed. This is pretty easy to check and make sure that you're running the correct version that you want. I mean, if you see something other than, like in this case, this is AVISynth plus 2772. It's running in multi-threaded mode, and it's the 386, otherwise known as x86 version. Okay. All right. To run the 64-bit version on the same script, you would do AVSmeter 64, and then same sort of deal. Now, in practice, the other thing I would recommend is that if you're going to seriously benchmark something, you run AVSmeter like 2 or 3 times, because there can be some variance in the overall speeds and memory usage depending on other conditions on your system, since other stuff's running in the background and using processor time and stuff like that. So just be aware of that. But as you can see for the 64-bit version here, everything looks pretty much the same until you get down to the frames per second, which is going at about 45 versus 19. And you'll notice that the memory usage is significantly higher too, at about 2.3 gigabytes. Thread usage is a little higher, but if it's just a little bit higher, that's not too much of an indicator. CPU usage is pretty much exactly the same. But as you can see, the total elapsed time between the 32-bit version and the 64-bit version is pretty different. And this is something that's not uncommon. If a filter supports both multi-threading and is 64-bit, it tends to be faster than the 32-bit version. That's just kind of as a rule of thumb. It's usually not this drastic, but there you go. All right, so that's pretty much the basics of benchmarking with AVSmeter. But let's take a look at some of the other features. If you want to check your installation and see what AVISynth is basically detecting that you have installed, then you can run AVSmeter AVSinfo. And you'll get this whole long list of stuff. All right, so let's scroll up a bit here. You'll see the version that's installed, whether it has multi-threading support, the location of the AVISynth DLL file that it's using, which is really important, and then the plugins directory or directories. And this is also important if you, for whatever reason, forget where you installed AVISynth, or if you have something where, for example, you might have a different directory for older plugins or something. Then it will divide up any plugins that you have installed into different versions. So in this case, this would be a 2.0 plugin for Smart Decimate that is written in C. Then there's C++ 2.5 plugins. So these would be for the 2.5 version of AVISynth. And then there's C++ 2.6 plugins, which make up the bulk of plugins that you're likely to be using in, a more recent version of AVISynth. It'll also list things like script files and any just kind of junk that you've left in there just because you dragged in some extra stuff as a result of just copying stuff over blindly. That'll show up under uncategorized files. And then if there's any sort of errors that it detected, it will show it down at the bottom here under plugin errors and warnings. In this case, it's letting me know that Smart Decimate cannot be used as a plugin for AVISynth. What it's saying is that C 2.0 plugins are not supported by AVISynth Plus. So I would need to have an older version of AVISynth installed in order to use that as a plugin. All right. And if you're wondering what the command is to do this for the 64-bit version of AVISynth, you guessed it. It's AVSmeter 64 AVSinfo. Boom. And as you can see, it's a similar thing here. We got our C++ 2.5 plugins, C++ 2.6 plugins, script files, uncategorized DLLs, and other uncategorized files. And there's no errors with this particular installation. So that's showing kind of like a plugin error, but what would happen if, for example, I yanked out the avisynth.dll file? I'll just go ahead and navigate to my Windows System32 directory. And go on down to the avisynth.dll. So I'm just going to take this and move it onto the desktop. And then I'm going to try this again. There we go. So immediately you'll get this error if you try and run the AVSinfo function on AVSmeter that says cannot load AVISynth DLL. The system cannot find the file specified. AVISynth x64 is probably not installed. So it's a really easy way to check and make sure that you have all the files installed that you need. The one thing that it doesn't check for at this point, unfortunately, I'm just going to double check here to be sure about this, but it won't check to make sure that you have the libffTw3, etc., DLL file. installed in your system directory, which is something required for Qtgmc to run, as well as a couple of other plugins. But aside from that, it's pretty comprehensive. Now, what if somebody asks you to run this command in order to troubleshoot AVISynth, like you're asking on a forum or something like that? Well, you could just, copy paste, but AVSmeter actually has a switch, which is documented here, for creating a log file. And so all you have to do is just run your command and then do -log after it. Okay. And then whatever directory you're in, which in this case will be tutorial, will show up with this log file. If you open up the log file, you see that it has all the information from before, just in a straight text file form. So it makes it really easy to copy paste or to just upload to a site or something like that. Or just to have a record of in case you want to add some additional stuff and then see what's changed or all sorts of stuff. It's pretty cool. You can also do logging for benchmarking. So let's take a look at, once again, this. We're going to run AVSmeter 64 on the YFRC AVISynth script and do a log file after that. And this will be essentially the same process as before, but as you'll see in a moment, when the benchmarking completes, it'll do something a bit different in the log file than what you see on screen here. And that is, it will record what the stats were for each individual frame during the benchmarking process. So this can be really useful if you're trying to track, for example, like a script where the file you're working with changes in complexity as you go along. And let's take a look here. Yeah, so you'll see up top here kind of the standard, and then you'll get a printout of the script that you're running. And then the performance data, which will be divided by frames per second, time per frame, CPU percentage, threads, and memory usage. So you'll see how all of these shift over time. And again, this can help to point out some significant performance drops within a script. So it's a very useful benchmarking tool. All right. What are some of these other switches? Well, there's also stuff like specify an AVISynth DLL to be used. This can be useful if you want to install some AVISynth DLLs from other versions and then try and use them to benchmark versus the one that you may currently have installed. There's also -info, which will display clip info. And let's just play around with that. Yeah, which again will give you kind of that little block that you get at the beginning of a benchmark run, where it'll tell you kind of info about the script, how long it is, what the settings are, that sort of thing. You can also, if you're really hardcore into benchmarking, export data of a render out as a CSV file. And that can be really helpful if you want to bring everything into a program like Microsoft Excel or LibreOffice Calc. Now, I personally don't bother getting that sophisticated when I benchmark stuff. I will just actually hand write out end results because I'm weird like that. But if you're somebody who's looking to do some sort of data analysis, this can be really helpful. Okay, so some other things. I'm going to get to the GPU setting in a moment here, but range will allow you to set a first and last frame within a range. So for example, if I wanted to just test between, okay, range equals 1000 to 1500. For whatever reason within PowerShell, in order for this to work, what I have to do is enclose this setting in quotes. But basically what it'll do is it will just run through 1000 to 1500 frames. So if you're looking at a specific range of frames within a file, this can be really helpful. Let's see. Time limit will let you do a certain number of seconds. So in this case, I'm going to do like 2. And it will literally just benchmark for 2 seconds. Because as you can see, it runs through 68 frames. So it's based on just actual running time rather than the time within the script itself, which is an interesting thing. This can be useful for like load testing. If you don't want to do an entire script, but you want to run for a certain number of seconds to check and see if your processor's throttling or something like that, then that might be useful. You can also set process priority to high. This can be useful if you've got some sort of a setup where you have some other programs that are kind of hogging stuff, or you're messing around with priorities on your system in general. It can help if you absolutely want this benchmarking to dominate over other background processes. In practice, I feel like running multiple benchmarking runs is just as effective and just kind of averaging those out as doing this, but it's up to you. Under the O option here, there's actually some really useful info. AVSmeter runs a quick test on a few frames at the start in order to measure the frames per second that AVISynth returns for the given script. The result is used to determine a suitable interval for measuring CPU, GPU memory usage and minimizing the overhead of these measurements. When -O is used, that test will be omitted. This can be useful if, for example, AVISynth is used with a script that writes a sequence of images where the speed test is irrelevant. Now, for most of us, that's not going to be the case. So don't use the -O thing unless you really have a specific reason to. All right, and then for the AVSinfo feature of AVSmeter, there's a couple of additional things. As I mentioned, you can do logging. You can also specify a custom plugin directory in addition to the DLL file. So this can be, again, useful if you have some sort of a separate version of AVISynth. Some people will kind of set up different directories with different batches of plugin files in it. I've never really messed with that personally, but it's something you can do. Then there's this LF, and let's just go ahead and actually run that. So LF, the L is shorthand for create log file, and then F will add in a bunch of extra stuff. So if we go back over here and open this up, what you'll see is it will include all the functions that you can perform within that installed version of AVISynth. So all the internal ones, and then all the external plugin functions that are available. So this can be really helpful if you're trying to figure out the full range of commands that are available to you within AVISynth. Some of these things are either kind of redundant or not necessarily things you'd actually use in practice, but it's still kind of a cool little extra tool to use. Okay, so what about the GPU switch? There are a few AVISynth plugins that will use the GPU on your system. Benchmarking those is interesting, though, because this function is not super smart. What it does basically is it just reads the GPU usage overall on your system rather than what is just being used for the particular plugin. So keep that in mind. You're going to see that when I run this because I'm also running a GPU accelerated encoding process in the background. So it's going to pick up some of that. But let's go ahead and do that. First, however, if you decide to do this, you will notice that on the page where you go to download AVSmeter, you'll see this link for GPU Z needed when using the GPU switch. Yeah, so you'll need to grab GPU Z first in order for this to work. So click on it and just grab the standard version. Choose your server, save it, virus scan it. That's an interesting one where it's got a clean bill of health, but a community score of -12. So that's interesting. But what GPU Z does, basically, is it's an overall GPU diagnostic program. And you don't actually install it so much as you just run it. And you get something like this. If you've ever used CPU Z, you'll be right at home with this. It's got kind of this whole range of stuff. It's got sensors telling you what the GPU clock and power consumption and temperature and all this other stuff is. So as far as I can tell, what you're doing with this is you'll see that right now GPU load is at somewhere between 20 and 28%. If you have this program up and running and you run a script that has a GPU component within it, let's run the interframe script with the GPU option enabled. And what'll happen, as soon as this sort of pre-scans the script, is you will see GPU usage. Current average, VPU usage, GPU memory usage. Now, if you open up GPU Z at the same time, you will see GPU load is the same on here and here. So this literally is just outputting what GPU Z is recording for the whole system. But if you're looking at GPU usage without having something like I do where there's a program in the background that's using some of this, It can be really helpful in sort of gauging how much GPU power is being used by a particular plugin. So it's not particularly fancy, but it does sort of bring information into one place for both CPU and GPU usage, which is cool. All right. Okay, so that's pretty much the full range of stuff, except for one thing. And that is, if you scroll down here, you'll notice INI file settings. So you will notice that up here, there's switches that enable you to do a number of different things on sort of a per command basis. Like you can set something like logging optionally. If you want to set any of those options permanently so that it's done every time you run AVSmeter, you can do so by changing the INI file. So if you want to create a log file or a CSV file or something like that, or display some additional info, you can do that within the INI file. Now, there are a few options here that are not present as command line options that can be kind of useful. Log directory will allow you to point to a directory other than you are currently running AVSmeter. So if you want to have sort of a central directory for recording all of your log files, that can be a really good setting to use. If you're wondering where the INI file is located, it's wherever the AVSinfo binaries are located. So if you've copied them into the same directory as your scripts and video files, then it would show up here. Otherwise, in the case of the setup that I've shown you, it will go wherever your AVSmeter binaries are put on your computer. And you can just double click to open this up. All right. So let's take a look at stuff here. So for example, if I was going to do a log directory entry, I can just put that in here. Log directory, there's already sort of a thing set up for that. So you'd want to do this in quotes, and easy way to do it is whatever directory you're in, just click on the address bar up above, do copy, and then paste that in. Make sure to put it in quotes. Okay. That's a pretty easy way to do that. Create log and create CSV already have options here. You just have to turn that to 1 to enable it or 0 to disable it. Frame range I wouldn't mess with unless you really have some very specific purpose to do so. Allow only one instance. This can be interesting if you wanted to, say, run both the 32 and the 64-bit version of AVSmeter at the same time, or to run two different versions of the same version of AVSmeter on different script files. I'm not quite sure why you'd want to do that, but it is an option available. There's some other technical stuff like directing all console output to standard out, change it to not use color. That may be useful if you were going to consider using AVSmeter within some other program, and you didn't want to kind of goof things up by using ANSI characters. Monitor GPU load is the same as setting the -GPU option. It's just it would do it all the time. Downside with that, though, is that, as I will show you here, if you exit GPU-Z and then try to run the script with the GPU tag, with the GPU option, it'll say cannot initialize GPU shared memory interface. So you would have to have GPU-Z running all the time, basically, in order for that to work. There are two other options that I think are really cool. One is log file date time suffix. What this does is it adds a date time suffix to all log and CSV files. This is useful if you don't want to rename your log files manually after every pass, so that you can just keep running benchmarks over and over and over again and checking the results each time. So I'm actually going to enable that. The other thing you can do is log use file save dialog, and what that does is it'll prompt you when the benchmarking is done with essentially a save as dialog box as to what you want the log file to be named and where you want it to be located. So, but let's do file date time suffix first. So just turn that on by changing that to 1, save it, close it. All right, so let's try running AVSmeter 64. Okay, so you'll notice that already there is a log file for YFRC within the directory. And something to keep in mind is that if you have the log file option enabled and you try and run the same benchmark again without changing the file name, the default behavior is not to overwrite the existing log file. So this makes the option of adding a suffix at the end even more important. So as you see here, what it does basically is it gives you the date and then the time at which the script is run. And that means you can just keep running this. And each time you do, it will create a new version that's really easy to tell when it was actually run. So personally, if I was going to be doing a lot of logging, I would enable this option in the INI file. And as you can see, pretty cool. All right, so that's pretty much everything you need to know about AVSmeter. Other than if it really helps you out, go onto the Doom 9 forums and give Groucho 2004 a positive message, because he kind of just does it for the fun of it. That's pretty much all I have to say. Thanks so much for watching. If you like this video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up or subscribe to my channel. I'm not going to have a crazy number of videos for a while because I'm currently preparing to teach a class. I will still try to make time for maybe smaller videos like this that go over really useful individual tools. And in fact, what I may end up doing is a little bit of info about kind of general video production concepts and stuff like that I may end up using as part of my class. So if you're interested in that, then subscribe to the channel and there will be stuff coming out periodically. If not, if you have any questions still, please leave it, on either the video or if you go to my blog. I love it if people ask workflow questions on the blog, because then it's really easy for someone to find that in a Google search. So if something gets answered, then it's a really great way for someone to find an answer to their question. So anyway, other than that, all I can say is that until next time, happy video editing.